And in time, he recognizes that he actually needed to forgive his captors. And once he did that, he said it was for the very first time I was able to sleep through the night and didn't have any problems after that. And to me, there's no medical test that will bring you to that kind of forgiveness. And I'm not trying to say every case is exactly the same, and that's how we have to solve all these things. But what I am saying is there are spiritual aspects to this warfare that's going on within this person's soul. And for us to bypass the spiritual components of it, I think is a disservice to the people who are struggling.
Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. I'm your host, Phil Cecil, and today on the podcast, we have Dr. Jacob Elwart, who's going to be talking about trauma-informed counseling. This episode is a bit of an announcement episode for the theme for our annual Rice Lecture Series. This happens every year in March. Next year, in 2026, the Rice Lecture Series will be on March 20th. And the theme will be a debate between historical biblical counseling and trauma-informed biblical counseling. We would love for you to join us for that, and we'll talk more about that in this episode. With that, let's welcome Dr. Elwart to the podcast. Dr. Elwart, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed counseling. But first, I think it's probably a good place to start is, what is trauma?
Well, there's lots of definitions out there, and it's hard to really nail it down. Sometimes when people talk about trauma, they tend to describe the effects of trauma. That's most often how it's talked about. Darby Strickland describes it as an emotional, spiritual, and physical disruption that occurs when a person is overwhelmed by extreme suffering. So broadly, it can include things like a soldier experiencing a catastrophic event in war and then years later experiencing some of the effects of that. Or it could be because of abuse. The term more recently has become popularized and broadened and used to refer to minor infractions against people because someone ignored them when they walked by them in the hallway or something. So, but in its, I think the form most often used is referring to an extreme form of suffering, potentially the effects of that suffering, but that's how people tend to use it.
So not, they don't tend to use it in relation to the event. So the soldier who has PTSD, what he experiences there, you're saying they wouldn't say that's the trauma. The trauma is how the effects of it once he's home.
Yeah, sometimes it's called traumatized or re-traumatized. So traumatized is like the effects of it on the person, and yeah, so it depends on the situation how the person uses it, but I've seen it used both ways, okay, about the event or about the effects of the event.
Gotcha. So do we see does this trauma come up in the Bible? Do we see examples of this?
Well, it all depends on how you define trauma, but I think even if trauma is defined on the one side as an event or on the other side as the effects of or the response to that event, I think the Bible speaks about it. The Bible, of course, talks about suffering. Mm-hmm. The Bible talks about the need for forgiveness. The Bible talks about anger, anxiety that people often experience after having experienced some kind of difficult event. The problem of evil, justice, guilt and shame, teaches us how to call out to God when we're in deep trouble. Teaches us how to hope, promises of eternity. So there's lots of aspects that we can use, and I think those are all topics that I might even be working through with a person who's experiencing that. First step is to try to understand what's going on, but certainly the scriptures do have a lot to say about human suffering and how we should respond to it.
Yeah. So what then is, when people start talking about trauma-informed counseling, what are they bringing into the counseling process that would make it trauma-informed?
My understanding is that trauma-informed counseling is a therapeutic approach that recognizes and responds to the impact of the trauma on a person's life. So it's a specific kind of approach that requires a level of training to understand how to properly respond to a person's trauma. It tends to be about creating a safe environment, empowering counselees, and avoiding re-traumatization. So when people use that term trauma-informed counseling, they tend to mean a special training designed to understand the signs and effects of a trauma and to help people by using their specific methods, their specific counseling methodology in order to help them.
So I wonder what that might look like. So maybe a month or so ago, we did an episode on homework. And I thought in that episode, you brought out very, very clearly what the goal of biblical counseling is, right? We want to point people to the Bible.
Right.
The Bible changes people over time. So maybe think of an issue. If someone comes to you, what would like the compare contrast be between that, the biblical way of doing it, and the more trauma-informed way of doing it? How might those look different?
Well, there are biblical counselors who are also trauma-informed. So I can't speak fully for them. I don't know how they would handle it fully. But from my understanding, especially on the secular side, the trauma-informed counselors, of course, are not, their main goal is not spiritual transformation as ours would be. So yes, you're right. Our approach would be we want to see spiritual transformation. We want to see people become more like Christ and how they respond to it. So that they're not, becoming debilitated or paralyzed in their Christian life or in their physical life. So, but yeah. So the other approach is going to be more just they'll have various ways in which they handle it. From what I've seen, they've used something called EMDR, eye movement, rapid eye movement desensitization or something like that.
Okay.
Mouthful. And then they use yoga therapy. I've seen cinema therapy. So there's various kinds of things that they use to try to get a person not to have to re-experience those events, but to help them to move on. And I think genuinely they do want to see that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's different methods to try and cope with it. So if a person came into our counseling center and they asked, do you have trauma-informed counseling, what would you say?
Well, I would tell them no, but would explain to them what I believe trauma is and how I think that a person's trauma can be helped by the Bible. Many times people count that as a badge of expertise. You're a trauma-informed counselor, but I'm confident that we can help with the basics of the Christian life. And I know sometimes people push back and say, that's too simplistic, and you're actually going to do more harm than you would good. But I think if we are careful to seek to understand the person and their particular situation, and then tie those specific issues to the Scripture, then I think we would actually do better than even a trauma-informed counseling. So obviously I'm biased in that way, but I think the Bible does talk about suffering. The Bible talks about our ability to grow in our control of our responses, and I want to take them to the Bible.
Yeah. Do you think, or maybe this has happened, or maybe it hasn't happened, is there a situation in which so someone comes in, they're asking for trauma-informed counseling, and they begin to then lay out for you, this is what has happened to me. Do you think there's a situation where you would say, okay, that's a bit beyond what I think we could handle here? We need to start looking for some outside help on it.
Yeah, I think there are limitations to what we can do. I don't think we should just go, hey, we can handle anything.
Yeah.
But the question is, to whom are we going to send them? Are we going to send them to someone who has some experience in doing that at a level that we don't? That's what I would do. I would have a biblical approach to it. Or are we just going to send them out to some secular, people who might be able to help them? But when we're dealing with deep spiritual issues, we want to be able to apply the Scriptures in a deep way to them. And so I don't think it's helpful for them to find their main source of help in some kind of secular approach. Yeah. And again, this might go back to some of the debate that's going on right now as to whether trauma is stored in the body, and that opens up a conversation, a much bigger conversation. But I wrote an article recently. It's called "Saving Sal: A PTSD Case Study," and I was pushing back against the book "The Body Keeps the Score," and using an illustration from real life as to a guy who looked like he was experiencing post-traumatic stress and how we would help someone like that, and showed how Bessel van der Kolk would help someone like that in comparison to how we might help. And if the trauma is stored in the body, then in that case, we would have limitations on the biblical counseling side, so we need to be careful there. But I don't buy that argument. I don't think there's any scientific proof for that. And so I'm going to be much more careful in sending them to just, hey, go talk to a psychiatrist about this. I would be careful to go, if this is a spiritual issue, you're dealing with unforgiveness or anxiety or deep suffering or whatever, then let's talk about what the scriptures have to say about it. And I tend to be a little bit more, I don't know if confident is the word, but willing to try things like that because I know of the power of the scriptures and the work of the Spirit on a person who has trusted in Jesus Christ. And so I want to help them as best as I can. I do recognize I have limitations, and I think it would be wrong for me to say I can handle any case that comes my way. But I think sometimes what we do is we short sell ourselves when really we have the almighty, all-knowing God who has told us everything that he wanted to tell us about every important topic in life. And for us to go, let's put that on the shelf and let's go find a professional that can help us is, I think, a little bit a naive or maybe not the most helpful way, maybe the kinder way to say it, most helpful way to help a person.
Yeah. So let's drill in on that example you gave. So in your article, you said you walked through, here's how the biblical counseling approach looked, and then here's how, I assumed you were using examples from the Body Keeps Score from
Correct.
the book. Mm-hmm. What did those two approaches look like? So what was the actual path he would have taken to try and do the trauma-informed counseling thing?
So the big one that he came across in his research over time and just his own studies, he's been in the psychiatric and medical world for decades, was EMDR, the rapid eye movement thing. So basically what that does is, and my understanding is, they get you to not to restate your trauma because they don't actually believe that you can clearly express your trauma. And if you do, it might actually re-traumatize you. So they have you somehow kind of think about it. The doctor kind of oversees the process. And then as you're thinking about it, the doctor notices different changes in your appearance. Mm-hmm. And as he does, he says, notice that. And then he moves on to the next thing. Okay, now let's think about this next part of your life when you're in the lunchroom and some bully came and attacked you after your dad had done maybe the original abuse was his dad getting whatever. So you just think through these things as the patient, and then he just says, notice that. So the psychiatrist doesn't actually know all the things that are going on and doesn't feel like he needs to know fully. He just wants the person to kind of relive them in a way without fully reliving them, and then somehow that helps him over time. So that's probably a very oversimplified and approach or understanding or expression of what they actually are doing. But that would be their approach. There's also, again, there's yoga therapy, there's cinema therapy where you would go to a movie that might express some of these emotions that you had experienced as a child in a way to help you readdress them somehow. And so I think they would probably walk you through what that would look like. But that would be their approach. Our approach would be, we want to understand more fully what happened, especially if it's affecting you now. So some people they deal with these past deep sufferings in ways that don't even need our specific help. They might have moved on. And so for us, we're not going to necessarily go, hey, we need to dig into your past.
To dig it all back up if they've already moved on, yeah.
But for someone who's like struggling right now, they're actually having flashbacks or they're like becoming paralyzed in certain situations or whatever, then for that, I'm going to say, let's talk about what's happened in the past. And I'll try to dig for things like, is there any unforgiveness? Is there some wrong views about God and the problem of evil? I mean, are you struggling with how God would allow something like that? Yeah. Do you believe in God's sovereignty that he could actually have prevented something like that? And how might that have accomplished good in your life and so on? And so that's not an easy process. And I've had a few cases where I've had to work through something like that. But in those cases, you just got to walk especially carefully. And we don't want to make it too simple, but we also don't want to make it overly complex.
Right. So what are then some of the dangers that we would find in in an idea like trauma-informed counseling?
It's interesting that some of the ways that the secular world describes trauma, as I mentioned earlier, is in terms not of the event itself, but more about the emotional responses to the event. And this is interesting because I was just rereading the book A Strange New World by Carl Trueman, and it kind of puts the spotlight not on the event that happened or the suffering that happened to the person, but actually on my response to the event, which sounds like it's not that big of a difference, but here's some thoughts from Trueman's book, A Strange New World. He argues that expressive individualism provides the backdrop for the strange new world in which we live. That is a world in which the modern self's desire for authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly according to a person's feelings. So re-traumatizing, he says, is when someone puts the category of my suffering in a way that offends me or makes me feel safe. So the concern shifts ever so subtly, not to whether something is right or wrong, but in terms of my response. It doesn't matter if I respond rightly or wrongly, it's how the counselor makes me feel. So if the counselor actually speaks truth to me that would actually help me move forward from this event that I'm still struggling with, that doesn't matter. It's how you made me feel in the process. And if the counselee who has experienced trauma senses that the counselor is claiming that his trauma is a result of the person's sin, then that immediately becomes a form of oppression and what they would call psychological oppression. And there was a time in which people would go to their pastor to actually hear truth spoken to them, but Trueman points out that's not the way it is as much anymore. We're finding that in many cases people are going to their pastors or their counselors for them to tell them to help them to feel good. That's the main thing, not to tell them the truth. And so Trueman argues that our culture has created a cult of personal happiness, and so that's all bound up in this thing this interwoven into this idea of trauma and how we help people. People are coming in with certain expectations, which is why they're asking, "Are you trauma informed?" Because that whole approach is like, "How can I help that person be safe?" rather than "How can I speak truth to them?" And we're not saying that all trauma is because of someone's sin. But if there is, one of the examples that Vander Kolk puts in his book, I noted this in my article, but the very first example that he draws is a guy who's struggling several decades after being in the Vietnam War. And he tells the story of a vet who at that time, a soldier at that time, who had his whole platoon killed or wounded just on the surprise attack from the Vietnamese. And his response to this American soldier's response to this was to go into a city and kill a bunch of innocent women and children and to rape some of the women. And so years later, decades later, if a counselor says to this guy, "Hey, this might be like a combination of innocent suffering, you lost your platoon, and guilty suffering because you committed some serious evils that were opposed to God," then he might not know how to deal with that. And so they're going to be less willing, that the trauma-informed counselors, I would say, in a secular approach, would be less informed or less inclined to go after what is true. And to me, that doesn't actually help him in his situation. Another example that I love to tell is the story of Louis Zamperini, who is the subject of the movie and the book Unbroken. And in the movie, it doesn't quite show how he actually turns towards forgiveness. But in the book, it's very clear that for every day after he returned from being a prisoner of war, he had night terrors. He couldn't sleep through the night. He'd wake up attacking his wife at times, choking her without even fully knowing why. And he couldn't stop it. He eventually went to a Billy Graham crusade, got saved, and started to understand the power of God's forgiveness for sinners. And in time, he recognizes that he actually needed to forgive his captors. And once he did that, he said it was for the very first time I was able to sleep through the night and didn't have any problems after that. And to me, there's no medical test that will bring you to that kind of forgiveness. And I'm not trying to say every case is exactly the same and that's how we have to solve all these things. But what I am saying is there are spiritual aspects to this warfare that's going on within this person's soul. And for us to bypass the spiritual components of it, I think, is a disservice to the people who are struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. So then what passages would you want to go to that you would think would be helpful as we think through this issue?
Well, a lot of that depends on what the individual is struggling with. And so I think for every single person in this category, I would definitely start with the reality of human suffering. So give them a theology of suffering, that suffering came into the world because of sin, that death came because of sin, and we experience the dying and the loss all the time because of, a lot of times, just the sin of humanity, not necessarily because of our own sin. Sometimes it is because of ours. So I would start there, but it could be that they're struggling with unforgiveness, so I might take them to Matthew 18 and talk about the parable of the unforgiving servant. If they're struggling with anxiety, I might take them to Matthew 6 or Philippians 4, 1 Peter 5. If it's depression, I want to help them learn how to have hope. And but the main thing is I want to weep with those who weep and recognize this is a difficult life that they've had to live, that I haven't had to experience anything to the level that they have experienced in terms of the trauma they might have experienced in war or in some kind of physical or sexual abuse. And so I want to just weep with them in terms of just feeling alongside of them, sympathizing with them, and then speak the truth in love. And so there's going to be a lot of passages in it, but it's going to depend a lot. I don't think there is a clear-cut, cookie-cutter kind of way that you can take any of these complex cases. You got to break them down into smaller parts and find out what is it that's driving this person. You know, one of the things they say in counseling is if you've seen one case, you've seen one case. And what they mean by that is just because you've seen like 10 trauma cases, let's say, you can't approach all of them in exactly the same way. Now, there might be some common principles or framework that you might use for all of them, but you really need to know the person and to understand what they're going through and what is driving them, and then see what the Bible has to say about bringing that to bear.
Yeah. One of the ways we want to help people think through this issue is our upcoming Rice Lecture Series, which will be on trauma-informed counseling. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this upcoming Rice Lecture Series. We're going to have a formal debate between a historic biblical counselor and a trauma-informed biblical counselor. So in the past, we've asked guys like Joel Beakey and Michael Haken and Jeremy Pierre to do like a series of sessions on a topic of theology or church history or counseling or something like that. Well, this time we chose to give a platform to two men who will who both have experience in practice and in teaching and writing. I think we probably had a third one there. And so on the historic biblical counseling side, we have Marshall Atkins, who is an adjunct professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. He's certified with ACBC, and he's going to give a really helpful case, I think, for taking the historic approach. And on the trauma-informed side, we have Brad Hambrick, who has authored several biblical counseling books and also teaches at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in North Carolina. And in the interactions that I've had with both of these men, I've found them both to be gracious and thoughtful. They both have a deep desire to please God and to understand His Word, and then think about the implications in terms of applying it to their own lives and to the lives of the people they're trying to help. And our goal in this debate is not to score points or to create, clips that'll get viral or something like that. Our goal in this is to provide some clarity about a hotly debated issue in our day. And so they're going to debate over three main issues, three main topics: the sufficiency of Scripture, the use of common grace insights, and then how should we think about trauma-informed counseling. And so that'll be March 20th. It'll be on in the morning, and it's a great way to just learn about some of these issues and think about how they might apply to our own ministries as pastors and servants in the church, and also as a way to fellowship with other pastors and students in our area. And I think it's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, great. So we hope everybody will be able to come out for that. If you want to learn more about the Rice Lecture Series, you can go to dbts.edu/RLS, and you can learn more there. So we hope everybody will be able to join us for that. So, Dr. Elwart, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Theologically Driven. We hope it was helpful for you and you found value out of it. Again, we would love for you to join us for the Rice Lecture Series on trauma-informed counseling. You can learn more about that and sign up for it at dbts.edu/rice. You can sign up there. That's a free event. Lunch will be included as well. Theologically Driven is a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you would like to learn more about our seminary, you can go to dbts.edu.